The frozen river water churns black beneath shattered ice. Two men stand at its edge, their breath forming clouds in the bitter Siberian dawn. Behind them, rifles snap to attention. Ahead of them, oblivion. One of these men once commanded Russia's mighty Black Sea Fleet. Nations courted his favor. Millions placed their hopes upon his shoulders. He bore the title no Russian had claimed before or since, Supreme Ruler of all Russia. Now, Admiral Alexander Kolchak faces a firing squad. This is the story of how a brilliant naval officer and Arctic explorer became the last hope of Imperial Russia, and how that hope died in blood and ice during history's most savage civil war. Our story begins not with politics or revolution, but with adventure. The year is 1900. Somewhere in the frozen wastes of the Arctic Ocean, a Russian scientific vessel cuts through waters few men have ever seen. The ship is called Zarya, meaning dawn, and she carries a crew of dreamers and scientists into the unknown reaches of the Russian Empire's northern frontier. Leading this expedition is Baron Edward von Toll, one of Russia's most celebrated explorers. His mission borders on the mythical, to discover Sannikov Land, a phantom territory rumored to exist somewhere beyond the Novosibirsk Islands, a place whispered about in explorers' tales but never confirmed, never mapped, never touched by human hands. Among Toll's crew is a 26-year-old naval lieutenant named Alexander Vasilievich Kolchak. Kolchak is restless. He'd been trained as one of the Russian Navy's finest cadets, assigned to the gleaming battleship Petropavlovsk, a posting that should have filled any young officer with pride. Instead, it bored him senseless. The rigid routines of naval service couldn't satisfy the hunger burning inside him, a hunger for discovery, for adventure, for something more than simply following orders. So when Baron Toll extended his invitation, Kolchak seized it with both hands. This is the dawn of the 20th century, an age of empires racing to claim every blank space on the map. Russia, under the autocratic rule of Tsar Nicholas II, is modernizing rapidly, desperate to understand its vast, mysterious territories. Scientific expeditions like Toll's aren't just about knowledge. They're about power, prestige, and national pride. The Zarya expedition becomes the crucible that forges Kolchak's character. For 2 brutal years, the ship and its crew battle the Arctic's cruelties. Pack ice threatens to crush their vessel. Toll himself nearly drowns during an encounter with a walrus. Kolchak finds himself fleeing from polar bears across frozen wastelands. Every day is a test of courage, endurance, and will. But Toll is obsessed. By May 2002, still unable to locate the mythical Sannikov Land, he makes a decision that borders on madness. With Zarya trapped in sea ice, Toll takes 3 men and sets off by dog sled toward Bennett Island, promising to find answers. The ship breaks free a month later and attempts to retrieve him, but impenetrable ice forces Zarya to turn back. Baron Edward von Toll and his 3 companions vanish into the white silence of the Arctic. Stranded, abandoned, almost certainly dead. For most officers, this would be the end of the story. Not for Kolchak. He returns 3,500 miles overland to St. Petersburg and immediately begins organizing a rescue mission. The plan is audacious to the point of suicide. Reach Bennett Island without a ship, using only sleds and small whaleboats to cross 600 miles of treacherous pack ice. Military authorities approve it only because no better option exists. Kolchak postpones his own wedding to return to the Arctic. On May 5, 1903, his 17-man team departs into the frozen hell. 3 months of grinding, exhausting travel follow.
Dog sled across shifting ice, whaleboat through frigid waters, always moving, always pushing toward the island where Toll might still be alive. They reach Bennett Island in August. What they find breaks their hearts. An abandoned camp, scientific notes, and a message in Toll's handwriting dated October 26th, 9 months old. Departing south today, we have provisions for 14 to 20 days. All are in good health. Baron Edward von Toll is never seen again. The rescue mission fails, but Kolchak succeeds in something more valuable. He returns home a national hero. The Imperial Geographical Society awards him their highest honor, the Konstantin Medal. Newspapers across Russia celebrate Kolchak Polyarny, Polar Kolchak, the officer who risked everything to save his commander. But there's no time for glory. In January 1904, when Kolchak finally reaches Yakutsk, he learns that Japan has attacked Russia's far eastern fortress at Port Arthur. The Russo-Japanese War has begun. Kolchak requests an immediate transfer to the front. But first, he races to Irkutsk to marry his fiancée, Sofia Fedorovna, in a ceremony delayed by Arctic ice and duty. 4 days after the wedding, he leaves for war. The world expects Russia to crush Japan easily, a great European empire versus an Asian upstart. Racial arrogance fills Russian newspapers with predictions of swift victory. Instead, Russia suffers humiliation after humiliation. Kolchak finds himself bottled up with the Pacific Fleet inside Port Arthur, commanding an aging destroyer while Japanese forces tighten their noose around the fortress. His primary duty becomes mine warfare, laying explosive charges in harbor approaches, a tedious and dangerous task. In December 1904, one of his mines scores a significant kill. The Japanese cruiser Takasago goes to the bottom. But individual successes cannot stop the disaster unfolding around him. Japanese artillery, positioned close enough to shell the harbor directly, systematically destroys Russia's Pacific Fleet. Ship after ship sinks at anchor. On December 20th, Port Arthur surrenders. 25,000 Russian prisoners march into captivity. Kolchak is among them, though as a wounded, ill officer, he's repatriated within months. He returns to St. Petersburg, decorated for bravery, but privately demoralized. The war has been a catastrophe for Russia, and a personal frustration for him. Yet ahead lies a conflict that will dwarf everything that came before.
June 28, 1914, Sarajevo. An assassin's bullets kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, and the dominoes begin to fall. Austria blames Serbia. Russia mobilizes to protect its Slavic ally. Germany declares war on Russia to support Austria. Within weeks, all of Europe's great empires are at each other's throats. The catastrophe that becomes known as World War I has begun. While Russia's armies stumbled toward disaster in East Prussia, 39-year-old Captain Alexander Kolchak takes command of a destroyer flotilla in the Baltic Fleet. An official report describes him as an outstanding officer in every respect, firm character, well-mannered, very disciplined. He is, in every sense, a model Tsarist officer, the type of man the empire was built upon. In the Baltic, facing the overwhelming superiority of Germany's imperial navy, Kolchak finds his element. Unable to challenge German battleships directly, Russian forces wage a guerrilla war of mines and night raids. Kolchak's flotilla alone lays 6,000 mines in the Gulf of Finland, creating a defensive barrier that shields St. Petersburg from naval attack. But Kolchak isn't content with defense. He leads daring nighttime operations, planting mines near enemy ports, Memel, Danzig, even Kiel itself. These raids required nerves of steel and flawless navigation through hostile waters. His courage earns him medals and an audience with Tsar Nicholas II himself. In 1916, Kolchak receives a promotion that stuns the naval establishment. At just 42, he becomes the youngest admiral in Russian history. His new command? The entire Black Sea Fleet based at Sevastopol in Crimea. He arrives with his wife Sophia and their 6-year-old son. 2 other children have already died in infancy, a grief the couple carries in silence. Across the Black Sea, Russia faces old enemies, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. Kolchak immediately adopts an aggressive strategy: mine-laying operations along enemy coasts, naval support for Russian ground operations near the Caucasus. His great dream is an amphibious assault on the Bosporus Strait, which would cripple the Ottomans and open a sea route to Russia's Western allies. Russia even creates its first naval infantry division specifically for this operation, placing it under Kolchak's command. But the operation never happens. It remains forever a dream, beyond Russia's crumbling capabilities. Still, Kolchak's Black Sea successes make him famous again. At a time when Russia is starving for good news, he delivers victories. Then comes March 1917. The news arrives slowly in Crimea, 1,000 miles south of the capital. Protests in Petrograd, the city formerly known as St. Petersburg, over bread prices and war casualties. Then strikes. Then mutinies. Revolution. Admiral Kolchak issues a proclamation to his fleet. I order all officers to continue, firmly and unwaveringly, to fulfill their duty to the Emperor and motherland. The next day, Tsar Nicholas II abdicates. For Kolchak, the world collapses. Everything he has built his life upon, duty, discipline, loyalty to sovereign and nation, suddenly has no foundation. He sees only chaos ahead. His sailors, however, celebrate wildly. Years of brutal discipline, terrible conditions, and rigid hierarchy might finally end. In Sevastopol, sailors form Soviet councils and elect committees. They demand that every ship bearing an imperial name be renamed. Discipline evaporates. Respect for authority crumbles. Kolchak struggles to hold the fleet together through sheer force of personality and careful compromise. But Bolshevik agitators were constantly among his men, demanding an end to the capitalist war and the removal of all Tsarist officers. In June, the crew of Kolchak's own flagship, Georgy Pobyedonosets, confronts him with an ultimatum. All officers must surrender their weapons and swords. To prevent bloodshed, Kolchak agrees, except for his own ceremonial sword. Rather than hand it over to mutineers, he walks to the deck rail and hurls it into the sea. Even the Japanese, our enemies, let me keep my weapons, he tells his men, voice shaking with fury. You will not have them now. Days later, he resigns his command and travels to Petrograd. His wife and son remain in Crimea. He will never see them again. Kolchak's defiant gesture makes headlines across Russia. Among conservatives, his reputation soars. Here finally is a leader who won't bow to revolutionary mob rule. Some even whisper that he might become the military dictator Russia desperately needs. This alarms the provisional government, especially War Minister Kerensky, who may see Kolchak as a potential rival. The solution is elegant. Kolchak is appointed to a military mission to Russia's Western allies. It's political exile, and everyone knows it. That summer, Kolchak travels via Norway to Britain, then to the United States, where he meets President Woodrow Wilson and senior American naval officers. But with Russia's military and political situation disintegrating, meaningful cooperation is impossible. In San Francisco, Kolchak receives an invitation to return home and enter politics as a candidate for the Cadets, Russia's last non-socialist party. But in Japan, while traveling back,
shocking news reaches him. The Bolsheviks have seized power in Petrograd. Lenin is now in control. Kolchak is appalled. He despises Lenin and his Bolsheviks, soon to rename themselves the Russian Communist Party. But what enrages him most is Lenin's immediate move to negotiate peace with Germany. For Tsarist officers like Kolchak, Russia's commitments to her World War I allies are sacred. Lenin's negotiations with Germany aren't just dishonorable, they're treasonous. Kolchak's decision is instantaneous. As an admiral of the Russian fleet, I considered our allied commitment to the war against Germany to remain in full force. The only way I could continue serving the motherland, now in the hands of German agents and traitors, was to join the war effort against Germany on the side of our allies. He offers his services to the British, who initially planned to send him to Mesopotamia, but soon they conceive a much larger role. Kolchak could become the leader who unifies anti-Bolshevik forces in the Russian Far East. In September 1918, Kolchak arrives in Vladivostok. He learns that various anti-Bolshevik groups, collectively called the Whites, have formed a provisional all-Russian government in Ufa. This government represents a continuation of the provisional government the Bolsheviks overthrew. Kolchak has little enthusiasm for it. Like many conservatives, he blames that provisional government for plunging Russia into chaos in the first place. When advancing Bolshevik forces push the provisional government from Ufa to Omsk, Kolchak travels 2,800 miles by train to join it. On November 5, 1918, after considerable debate, he agrees to become Minister of War and Navy. 2 days later, he forms a general staff and travels to the front to assess the military situation. What he finds is chaos beyond imagination. Across the former Russian Empire, white forces are scattered across the periphery. General Boldyrev commands 180,000 provisional government troops around Omsk. General Denikin's volunteer army in southern Russia numbers about 50,000. The northern Russian government, a tiny white enclave, has just 6,000 men. Supporting them are various allied contingents, British, French, American, Japanese, mostly in training and support roles. The Allies' most critical contribution is arms, ammunition, and supplies flowing through Russia's seaports. Then there's the Czechoslovak Legion, 50,000 strong, an anomaly of history. These Czech volunteers had been fighting alongside Russia against Germany. When the Bolsheviks made peace, the Legion received permission to travel via the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok, then sailed to France to rejoin the Allies. But the Bolsheviks changed their minds and tried to disarm the Czechs, who fought back and now control key points along the Trans-Siberian Railway, the crucial east-west artery. Adding further complexity, Russia's civil war rages alongside multiple wars of national independence. Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, all fighting for freedom from Russian control. White forces are fragmented geographically and politically, from left-wing socialist revolutionaries to right-wing monarchists who want the Tsar restored. Facing them, the gigantic resources of Lenin's Bolshevik state, controlling Russia's major cities, industrial centers, and transport hubs. The Red Army numbers around 800,000 troops. The challenge is almost inconceivable. Into this maelstrom, politics intrudes with violence.
On November 18, 1918, 300 Cossack troops ride into Omsk and arrest every socialist revolutionary delegate they can find. The provisional government is abolished by its own Council of Ministers, who immediately move to elect a new supreme ruler of Russia, a dictator with absolute power. The man they choose is Admiral Alexander Kolchak. A proven leader, a brilliant military record, widely respected, close ties with Western allies. Above all, a man who shares their vision. Only a return to iron discipline and law can save Russia from the abyss. Kolchak himself hasn't sought this position. He believes others are better suited. But duty calls, as it always has.
and Alexander Kolchak answers. He becomes supreme ruler of all Russia. November 1918. The guns fall silent on World War I's Western Front. But across the former Russian Empire, a new conflict explodes into full fury, a civil war that will rage from Central Europe to the Pacific Ocean and claim an estimated 9 million lives. Lenin and his Bolsheviks battle for survival against their many enemies, the Whites. And the Whites' great hope is their newly proclaimed supreme ruler, Admiral Alexander Vasilyevich Kolchak. 44 years old, war hero, man of duty and discipline. Millions look to him to crush the Bolsheviks, avenge the murdered Tsar, and save Russia from collapse. Kolchak's authority now equals that of a Tsar, with absolute veto power over all legislation. Yet despite his elevation, he doesn't surround himself with luxury or move into palaces. He continues renting a modest townhouse in Omsk, carefully monitoring his expenses. He's joined by his mistress, Anna Timireva, who also serves as his translator. His wife Sophia and their son, whom he hasn't seen in over a year, have fled to Paris, joining the growing community of White Russian exiles. As supreme ruler, Kolchak faces challenges of almost incomprehensible scale, and it quickly becomes clear that he is neither a natural nor a sophisticated politician. His manner is stiff, severe, his sentences short and blunt. When frustrated, he becomes angry and inflexible. He clings rigidly to his concept of honor, both personal and national. Yet he's also extraordinarily hard-working, well-mannered, and capable of personal kindness and generosity. Kolchak's first priority is securing recognition from the Russian people, the army, other white governments, and crucially, from the Allies, Britain, France, and the United States. The Allies are initially alarmed by the unexpected coup that brought him to power. He immediately reassures them in his first proclamation. "I will not go down the road of reaction or the ruinous path of partisanship. My main objective is to build a combat-ready army, to defeat Bolshevism and establish law and order so that the people can freely choose the form of government they wish." Whether Kolchak truly wants democracy would never be tested. In white-controlled territories, reaction is broadly positive among conservatives desperate for strong leadership. But left-wing groups, socialist revolutionaries, and Mensheviks react with fury. They convene their own constituent assembly at Yekaterinburg, where the Tsar and his family were murdered just months before. This assembly refuses to recognize Kolchak and calls for resistance. Kolchak's response is swift and brutal. He orders Czech troops to arrest all assembly members. Several are later murdered in a revolt in Omsk that killed several hundred socialist revolutionaries. The supreme ruler has shown himself unafraid to use dictatorial powers, and such firmness helps consolidate his position but turns former allies into bitter enemies. The socialist revolutionaries now accuse Kolchak of wanting to make himself Tsar, claiming he's a greater threat than the Bolsheviks themselves. Elsewhere, white forces accept Kolchak's authority. General Yudenich in the northwest, Marushevsky in the north, General Denikin commanding the volunteer army in the south. Areas under direct white control operate as military governments. Local councils can't be trusted due to their support for Bolshevik policies like land reform. The whites ban trade unions and return nationalized industries to private ownership. Wherever they encounter resistance, white forces are ruthless. When an uprising erupts in Yenisei, Kolchak orders that any village offering armed resistance be burned to the ground, men shot, property seized, hostages taken. If locals cooperate with Bolshevik partisans, they're to be executed. White forces kill an estimated 10,000 Russians, crushing the Yenisei revolt, all in direct consequence of Kolchak's orders. The Bolsheviks are equally merciless in territories they control. Historians differentiate between red and white terror. The red terror is directed from above, an official policy of mass murder based on class. The White Terror is reactive, improvised, usually carried out by local commanders. To ordinary Russians, suffering and dying in unimaginable numbers, the distinction makes no difference. Economically, Kolchak holds one advantage. He controls 2/3 of Imperial Russia's gold reserves, 490 tons captured from the Bolsheviks, now stored in Omsk. By late 1918, several Allied expeditionary forces operate in Russia to assist the Whites. More important than troops are the arms, ammunition, and supplies, especially from Britain. But support comes with strings. The Allies inform Kolchak that French General Maurice Janin, based in Vladivostok, should take overall command of all Allied and Russian soldiers. Kolchak rejects the idea outright, declaring he'd rather have no foreign aid than submit to such humiliation. Eventually, a compromise emerges. Janin will command only the Czechoslovak Legion and small Allied contingents, mostly held back to guard supply lines and railways. Some historians believe Janin's wounded pride will later have bitter consequences for Kolchak. The war against the Bolsheviks remains Kolchak's overriding focus, his dream to recapture Moscow and Petrograd. From the provisional government, he inherits advanced plans for a major offensive aimed at Vologda, intended to break through to White forces near Arkhangelsk and gain access to Allied aid arriving via northern ports. The offensive begins November 27th. The White Yekaterinburg Army faces the Third Red Army, which is ordered to hold a 250-mile front while suffering serious shortages of fuel, food, and warm clothing. The attack breaks through. The Reds retreat with heavy losses. On December 24th, the Whites take the city of Perm, a major victory. They capture 30,000 prisoners, 120 artillery guns, 1,000 machine guns, and 9 armored trains. Eager to avenge this humiliation, the Red Army launches a counteroffensive in January, but after small gains and huge losses on both sides, the attack bogs down. The capture of Perm fills Kolchak and his generals with hope. They organize a massive new offensive for spring 1919, planning to attack towards Vyatka and Saratov, break through the overextended Red Army center, and envelop Moscow from north, east, and south. The offensive begins in March. White forces advance rapidly towards the Volga River. By late April, they've pushed 200 miles, capturing territory rich in industrial and agricultural resources, threatening the cities of Kazan, Simbirsk, and Samara. French Prime Minister Clemenceau and British Secretary of State for War Winston Churchill send congratulations to Kolchak. Moscow itself finally seems within reach. With military success and renewed international backing, Kolchak's government has never looked stronger. The days of the Bolsheviks appear numbered.
Lenin and the Bolsheviks are deeply alarmed, but extraordinary measures have already been taken that will soon enable them to strike back with devastating force. People's Commissar for Military Affairs Leon Trotsky has overseen the doubling of the Red Army's size within a year. Now 1.5 million strong, it's backed by the full resources of the state, mobilized under war communism. In April, Lenin declares Kolchak enemy number 1 of the Soviet Republic. All on Kolchak becomes the Bolsheviks' rallying cry. The Red Army's Eastern Front receives 2 brilliant new commanders, General Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Commissar Mikhail Frunze. In April 1919, they launch a counteroffensive with 80,000 troops. White Russian forces soon retreat rapidly. On June 9th, Ufa falls, a crucial White stronghold. At the height of this crisis, Kolchak receives a potential lifeline, an offer of military support that might turn the tables. Finland, ruled by Russia for over a century, had declared independence following the Bolshevik Revolution. Finland's regent, Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, now offers to attack Petrograd with 100,000 troops, in exchange for Kolchak recognizing Finnish independence. Kolchak flatly declines. Even in this desperate hour, he will not accept any dismemberment of Russia's historic empire.
By August, the Red Army crosses the Tobol River. But Kolchak has a plan. Sacrifice territory for time to rest his troops and regroup. As Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Kolchak regularly visits frontline units to see conditions and speak with the men. He brings extra rations, coffee, sugar, tobacco to lift morale. He speaks always of duty and the motherland. But small gifts and rhetoric cannot compensate for his forces' increasingly dire situation. They're desperately short of supplies, transport, fuel, clothing, weapons, a crisis partly caused by massive corruption and theft behind the lines. The return of Tsarist-era discipline, including flogging and beating soldiers, creates further discontent. Desertions are rife, particularly among new conscripts from the peasantry who have little reason to love the whites. Privately, Kolchak is increasingly strained and unable to control his temper. He looks visibly exhausted. At 44, his hair has turned completely gray. Rumors of morphine addiction circulate, probably malicious gossip, but the supreme ruler has become erratic and agitated. That August, Kolchak throws himself into planning a counteroffensive to support General Denikin's thrust toward Moscow. Great hopes rest on its outcome. The attack begins September 1st. Initial results are excellent. Kolchak's forces smash through the Third Red Army, taking thousands of prisoners, advancing more than 100 miles, driving the Reds back across the Tobol. But the great encirclements Kolchak planned that were supposed to annihilate Red forces failed to materialize due to lack of cavalry. At the Tobol River, the Reds dig in and re-establish a defensive line. Kolchak's troops, exhausted by their advance and weakened by losses, can go no further. October 1919. Along the Civil War's Eastern Front, the ground shakes with explosions as the Red Army launches yet another major offensive. The Whites fight stubbornly, but when the Reds capture bridgeheads across the Tobol, the decision is made to begin strategic withdrawal. General Denikin's advance toward Moscow also comes under fierce counterattack. Everywhere, the Reds are advancing. Omsk, Kolchak's capital, is under threat. Kolchak wants it held to the last man. "If we lose Omsk, we lose all," he declares. But the speed of the Red advance leaves no time to organize proper defense. The city is hurriedly evacuated on November 10th. Russia's gold reserves are loaded onto a Red Cross train and moved to safety, Kolchak having dismissed General Janin's invitation to place them under international protection. "I do not believe you," Kolchak tells Janin. "I would rather leave the gold with the Bolsheviks than give it to the Allies." His words reveal how far trust has broken down. Kolchak hopes to establish a new defensive line along the Ob River, 375 miles east of Omsk, but by December, this line too is crumbling. The final blow comes from a breakdown in relations with the Czechoslovak Legion. These Czech troops control the Trans-Siberian Railway, the vital artery for movement of troops and supplies. The Legion's officers now decide that evacuating their own men takes priority over moving Kolchak's troops and supplies. Kolchak himself travels east on the Supreme Ruler's train, accompanied by the gold reserves, his destination Irkutsk, where he plans to establish new headquarters. Around him, the country is in chaos. White forces are in full-scale retreat. Government authority has collapsed. A typhus epidemic spreads rapidly. Large areas are controlled by Bolshevik partisans or bandits. Famine looms. On December 25th, at Nizhnyudinsk, 280 miles short of Irkutsk, Kolchak's train is halted by Czech troops acting on General Janin's orders. He's held for 2 weeks with limited communications as chaos engulfs Siberia. While he waits, Bolsheviks and socialist revolutionaries launch a revolt in Irkutsk and seize control of the city. Even Kolchak's escape route is now closed. He is completely isolated. Military disaster has swept away his forces. The Allies have lost patience with his failure to compromise. His authority is destroyed. On January 4, 1920, at the insistence of his own Council of Ministers, Kolchak issues his last decree as supreme ruler, promising to resign in favor of General Denikin. With enemies on all sides, Kolchak plans to escape south into Mongolia with the 60 officers and 500 men still under his command. He announces that no man will be compelled to join. He'll accept only volunteers. At dawn the next day, of his 500 soldiers, only 10 remain. Kolchak sees the game is up. On the advice of his officers, he places himself under the protection of the Czechoslovak Legion. On January 10, 1920, Kolchak's train finally leaves for Irkutsk under Czech protection. "These allies will sell me," Kolchak predicts to one of his generals. Sure enough, upon arrival in Irkutsk 5 days later, Kolchak is handed over to the city's new Socialist Revolutionary Council. The Czechs claim they have no choice. It's the only way to ensure their own safety as they escape the country. Some Russian historians later claim it was to cover up Czech theft of Russia's gold reserves, which had been traveling with Kolchak. This is almost certainly myth, though legends about Kolchak's missing gold endure to this day. The interrogation of Admiral Kolchak begins January 21, 1920. He answers questions willingly, avoids implicating subordinates, and takes full responsibility for his government's actions. But the Bolsheviks have now taken control of Irkutsk, and he knows his prospects aren't good. He, after all, had instructed his own officers to shoot communist prisoners. The civil war must be merciless, he'd said. Either we shoot them or they shoot us. Then suddenly, hope. Several thousand troops loyal to the admiral begin a desperate advance on Irkutsk, aiming to free Kolchak and other white officers held there. They battled to within 5 miles of the city, but they're massively outnumbered and outgunned. It's a gallant but doomed rescue attempt. Kolchak's fate is sealed.
In the early hours of February 7, 1920, on orders from the Bolshevik Military Revolutionary Committee of Irkutsk, Admiral Alexander Vasilievich Kolchak and the last prime minister of his government, Viktor Pepelyev, are taken from their cells and led to the bank of the Angara River. An order is given: platoon, against the enemies of the revolution, fire. The two bodies are pushed through holes in the ice and never seen again. With the execution of Admiral Kolchak, the Whites' last pretense of unified national leadership is over. 1920 sees their defeat on all fronts. Western allies evacuate their remaining troops from Russia. Though fighting continues in corners of the new Soviet Empire for 3 more years, the ultimate victory of Lenin and the Bolsheviks is no longer in doubt. It comes at an appalling cost: an estimated 750,000 military deaths, 75,000 executions, 5 million civilian deaths from famine, and 3 million deaths from typhus. The Russian Civil War is one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The career of Admiral Kolchak, Russia's only supreme ruler, and for more than a year the world's great hope for defeating Bolshevism, ends in total failure. He faced extraordinary challenges and showed himself a leader committed to duty, discipline, and his imperial vision of the Russian motherland. He was a skilled naval commander and charismatic figurehead, but he was also rigid and inflexible, unable to compromise or forge the alliances he needed to succeed. Under the Soviet regime, Admiral Kolchak's name is disgraced, an enemy of the people, a would-be tyrant in the mold of the Tsars, a traitor with no known grave. Today, a cross stands at the presumed site of his execution. A memorial stands in Irkutsk. For some Russians, Kolchak remains a romantic, tragic figure who battled for an old empire and stood by his sense of duty to the bitter end. The frozen river water churned black that morning beneath shattered ice. 2 men stood at its edge,
their breath forming clouds in the bitter Siberian dawn. One of them had once been supreme ruler of all Russia. Now, he was simply a name that history would debate, a symbol of duty, discipline, and ultimately, of dreams drowned in ice and blood. This was Admiral Alexander Kolchak. And this was how empires die.